There's no pain like losing a child, and no wound that cuts deeper than knowing you failed to protect them. For 20 years, Caleb Rourke carried that burden through the mountains, drinking away the memory of his daughter's face. Then, one dusty afternoon outside the blacksmith's shop, he saw her again. The homeless boy had the same auburn hair, the same green eyes that haunted his dreams. The child was maybe 10 years old, all skin and bones, with dirt under his nails, and hunger in his belly. Caleb knew he should walk away, keep his ghosts buried where they belonged. But something in those familiar eyes stopped him cold. He found himself saying words he never thought he'd speak again. What happens when a broken man gets a second chance he never asked for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Rourke had learned to live with ghosts. They followed him through the narrow streets of Cedar Falls like faithful hounds, padding silently behind his worn boots as he made his way from the saloon to his cabin on the hill. 20 years had passed since he buried his daughter Rose beneath 3 feet of mountain snow, and still her memory clung to him like morning mist on the peaks. The town knew his story, though nobody spoke of it anymore. How the great mountain trapper Caleb Rourke had lost everything in one terrible winter storm, his wife to childbirth fever, his 5-year-old daughter to the cold that followed. How he'd emerged from those mountains a different man entirely, hollow-eyed and broken, trading his reputation as the finest tracker in 3 territories for a bottle and a cabin where he could drink himself to sleep each night. Cedar Falls itself was dying, much like the man who haunted its streets. What had once been a thriving frontier town, fed by silver mines and cattle drives, now struggled to keep its few remaining businesses open. The mines had played out, the cattle moved to greener pastures, and most folks had packed up their dreams and headed for better prospects. Those who remained were either too stubborn, too poor, or too broken to leave. The blacksmith shop sat at the corner of Main and Pine, its forge still glowing despite the town's decline. Old Henrik still pounded iron into horseshoes and farm tools, though he had fewer customers each month. The sound of his hammer on anvil had become Cedar Falls' heartbeat, steady, determined, but growing weaker with each passing season. It was outside Henrik's shop that Caleb's world tilted on its axis that Tuesday afternoon in late September. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, huddled against the weathered wooden wall like a lost puppy. His clothes were little more than rags, patched and repatched until the original fabric was anyone's guess. Dirt caked his small hands and streaked his hollow cheeks, but it was his eyes that stopped Caleb dead in his tracks. Green eyes, the same shade of green as spring grass after the snow melts. The same eyes that had looked up at him 20 years ago, bright with laughter as Rose begged for one more story before bedtime. The same eyes that had closed forever in that mountain cabin while the storm raged outside and Caleb held her small, still form. The boy noticed him staring and shrank. Further against the wall, clearly accustomed to being unwelcome wherever he appeared. But those eyes, Rose's eyes, watched Caleb with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that nearly brought the mountain man to his knees. "You hungry, boy?" The words escaped before Caleb could stop them, his voice rusty from disuse and too much whiskey. The child nodded, not trusting his voice, those familiar green eyes never leaving Caleb's face. "Doc." Henderson emerged from his office across the street, just as Caleb was reaching into his pocket for the few coins he carried. The physician was one of the few people in Cedar Falls who still spoke to Caleb regularly, though their conversations rarely extended beyond discussions of Caleb's failing liver and the doctor's concern for his drinking. "Caleb," Doc called out, his weathered face creased with worry. "What are you doing with that boy?" "Feeding him," Caleb replied gruffly, pressing a silver dollar into the child's palm. "When's the last time you ate, son?" "Day before yesterday," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Found some apple cores behind Mrs. Patterson's kitchen." Mrs. Patterson ran the boarding house 3 blocks down, a stern woman with a kind heart hidden beneath layers of frontier pragmatism. She'd lost her own husband to a mining accident 5 years past and had been struggling to keep her business afloat ever since Sheriff Martinez rounded the corner just as Caleb was helping the boy to his feet. The lawman's hand instinctively moved to his gun belt when he saw the interaction, though he relaxed when he recognized Caleb. Martinez was young for a sheriff, maybe 35, but he'd proven himself capable of handling the few troubles that still plagued Cedar Falls. "Problem here, Caleb?" Martinez asked, though his tone suggested he was more curious than concerned. "No problem," Caleb said, steadying the boy with a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Just getting this young fellow some food." The sheriff studied the child with professional interest. "You got a name, son? Family around here?" The boy shook his head, auburn hair falling across his forehead in a way that made Caleb's chest tighten with recognition. "Name's Danny. Don't got no family that I know of." "Where you been staying?" Martinez pressed gently. "Anywhere I can find." Danny replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd learned early that life offered no guarantees. "Barns, mostly. Sometimes under porches when it rains." Caleb felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was long dead. Protectiveness, maybe. Or just the simple human decency that 20 years of grief hadn't quite managed to kill. "Come on, boy. Let's get you fed proper." He guided Danny toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, aware of the curious stares that followed their unlikely pair down Main Street. Caleb Rourke, the town drunk and hermit, walking alongside a homeless child like he was his own kin. It would be the talk of Cedar Falls before supper time. Mrs. Patterson's establishment was clean but worn, like everything else in the dying town. The front parlor smelled of lavender and old wood, with lace curtains that had seen better days, framing windows that looked out onto the street. She emerged from the kitchen when she heard the front door chime, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Caleb Rourke," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Been a while since you've darkened my doorway." "Ma'am," Caleb nodded respectfully. "Wondering if you might have a hot meal for this boy here. I'll pay for it." Mrs. Patterson's stern expression softened as she took in Danny's condition. She was a mother herself, had raised 3 children before they moved east to find their fortunes, and the sight of a hungry child triggered every maternal instinct she possessed. "Of course," she said, ushering them toward the dining room. "Sit yourselves down. I've got beef stew on the stove and fresh bread cooling." As Danny ate with the desperate hunger of someone who never knew where his next meal would come from, Caleb found himself studying the boy's features. The resemblance to Rose was uncanny, not just the eyes, but the delicate bone structure, the way his nose crinkled slightly when he concentrated on his food. Even his mannerisms reminded Caleb of his daughter, the way he held his spoon, the careful way he ate to make the food last longer. "You got somewhere to sleep tonight, boy?" Caleb asked when Danny finally slowed his eating. Danny shook his head, those green eyes looking up at Caleb with something approaching trust. "I'll find someplace. Always do." The smart thing would be to walk away. Give the boy a few more coins. Maybe speak to Sheriff Martinez about finding him a proper place to stay. Then return to his cabin and his bottle and the familiar comfort of his misery. But Caleb found he couldn't do it. Couldn't abandon this child who looked so much like the daughter he'd failed to save. "You can stay with me tonight," he heard himself say. "Got a spare room up at my cabin. Nothing fancy, but it's dry and warm." Danny's face lit up with such genuine gratitude that Caleb had to look away, his eyes suddenly burning with tears he hadn't shed in years. On his mantel at home sat a hand-carved wooden doll, gathering dust among the empty bottles and neglected remnants of his former life. He'd made it for Rose during one of their camping trips, whittling away at a piece of pine while she slept by the fire. She treasured that doll, carrying it everywhere until the day she died. Now it sat forgotten, a monument to his failures. As a father, maybe it was time to remember what it felt like to protect someone again. Maybe this hollow-eyed boy with Rose's green eyes was offering him something he'd thought was lost forever, a reason to be better than he'd been. As they walked up the hill toward his cabin that evening, Danny chattering nervously about nothing in particular, Caleb allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have purpose again, to matter to someone, to be needed. The ghost that followed him seemed quieter tonight, as if they too were curious about this unexpected turn in his long, dark road. The boy slept like the dead that first night, curled up on Caleb's old sofa with a blanket that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Caleb sat in his chair across the room, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the rise and fall of Danny's chest. It had been 20 years since he'd shared his space with another living soul, and the presence of this child in his home stirred emotions he thought were buried as deep as his daughter. When dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Danny was already awake. He sat quietly on the sofa, clearly uncertain about what was expected of him, those familiar green eyes taking in every detail of Caleb's sparse cabin. "Morning," Caleb said, his voice gravelly from sleep and whiskey. "Morning, sir," Danny replied, politely. "I can go now, if you want." "Don't want to be a bother. You hungry?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Caleb found himself moving toward the kitchen with something approaching purpose. It had been years since he'd cooked for anyone but himself, but he managed to fry up some eggs and bacon, pleased when Danny ate with obvious appreciation. "Got a question for you, boy," Caleb said as Danny finished his breakfast. "You said you don't have family. Where do you come from before Cedar Falls?" Danny's expression grew guarded. "Been traveling mostly. Looking for someone who might want." I guess. Anyone in particular?" The boy hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "Found this with my things when I was real little. Lady who was caring for me said it might be important someday." Caleb took the letter, noting how carefully Danny had preserved it despite its obvious age. The paper was worn soft from handling, the ink faded but still readable. As he unfolded it, his heart began to beat faster. The letter was addressed to someone in Silver Creek, a town about 5 days' ride through the mountains. The handwriting was feminine, delicate, and the water damage had made parts of it illegible. He could make out enough to understand its significance. "My dearest sister," the letter began, "if anything should happen to me, please know that Daniel is a good boy who deserves a loving home. He has his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn streak. The directions to your place are written on the back, should he ever need to find you. Please tell him his mother loved him with all her heart." Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he turned the letter over. There, in the same careful script, were directions to a house on Elm Street in Silver Creek. "You think they're still there?" Danny asked, hope threading through his voice. "My family, I mean?" Caleb looked at this boy who'd stumbled into his life like a gift he'd never asked for and didn't deserve. The smart thing would be to take him to Sheriff Martinez, let the law handle finding his relatives. But something in those green eyes, Rose's eyes, made him want to be the one to help this child find his place in the world. "Tell you what," Caleb said slowly, "Silver Creek's not too far. Maybe 5 days' ride through the mountains. I could take you there, make sure you find these folks safely." Danny's face transformed with joy and relief. "You'd do that? Really?" "Don't see why not," Caleb replied, though his heart was already protesting the decision. 5 days on the trail with this boy who looked so much like his daughter. 5 days of remembering what it felt like to have someone depend on him. 5 days of pretending he might be worthy of trust again. "I don't have any money to pay you," Danny said quietly. Didn't ask for any, Caleb replied. Sometimes a man just does what's right because it needs doing. They spent the morning preparing for the journey. Caleb gathered supplies, food, blankets, ammunition for his rifle, while Danny helped with quiet efficiency. The boy had clearly learned to make himself useful wherever he found himself, anticipating needs and staying out of the way when necessary. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Falls. By noon, both Doc Henderson and Sheriff Martinez had found reasons to visit Caleb's cabin, their concern thinly veiled behind casual conversation. Taking the boy to Silver Creek, I hear, Doc said, settling into Caleb's spare chair with the familiarity of an old friend. That's right, Caleb replied, continuing to pack his saddlebags. Long journey for a man who hasn't left town in 5 years. Caleb paused in his packing, meeting the doctor's concerned gaze. Boy's got family there. Deserves a chance to find them. And what about when you get back? Doc asked gently. What then? The question hung in the air between them. Caleb knew what the doctor was really asking. What would happen when he delivered Danny to his relatives and found himself alone again? When the brief reprieve from his grief came to an end and he had to return to his empty cabin and his ghosts. I'll figure that out when the time comes, Caleb said finally. Sheriff Martinez arrived just as Doc was leaving, and the two men exchanged meaningful looks on the front porch. Martinez entered the cabin with the careful manner of someone walking into potentially dangerous territory. Caleb, he said with a nod. Mind if we talk? They stepped outside while Danny continued packing his few belongings. The boy had precious little, a change of clothes that had seen better days, a small knife, and an old harmonica that looked like it had been well loved. You sure about this? Martinez asked, taking responsibility for that boy. Just helping him find his kin, Caleb replied. Nothing more complicated than that. And if his kin don't want him, what then? The question struck closer to home than Caleb cared to admit. He'd been trying not to think about that possibility, focusing instead on the hope in Danny's eyes when he talked about finding family. Cross that bridge when we come to it, he said. That evening, as they prepared to leave at first light, Caleb found himself sitting on his porch with Danny beside him, both of them watching the stars emerge over the mountains. The boy was quiet, perhaps overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. You scared? Caleb asked. Danny considered the question carefully. A little bit. What if they don't want me? Then we'll figure something else out, Caleb said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. One way or another, you'll be all right. You promise? The word hung between them like a bridge over a dangerous canyon. Caleb hadn't made promises in 20 years, not since he'd promised Rose he'd keep her safe and failed so completely. But looking at this boy with his daughter's eyes, feeling the fragile trust building between them, he found himself nodding. I promise. As they settled in for their last night in Cedar Falls before the journey, Caleb lay awake listening to Danny's steady breathing from the next room. Tomorrow they would head into the mountains together, two broken souls searching for something that might heal them both. The letter crinkled softly in Danny's pocket as the boy turned in his sleep, carrying with it the hope of family and belonging that had sustained him through who knew how many cold, lonely nights. Caleb closed his eyes and tried not to think about how much he was already dreading the day when he'd have to say goodbye. The mountain trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind as Caleb and Danny made their way deeper into the wilderness. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and their breath formed small clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin mountain atmosphere. Danny rode behind Caleb on the old Mari, his small hands gripping the saddle with white-knuckled determination. The boy had admitted he'd never been on a horse before, but he was learning quickly, his natural balance and fearless spirit serving him well. Tell me about where you grew up, Caleb said over his shoulder as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. Don't remember much, Danny replied, his voice slightly muffled by the scarf Caleb had wrapped around his neck. Was real. Little when the lady who was caring for me died. Been on my own mostly since then. What about before that? Anything at all? Danny was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb could feel the boy's concentration as he searched his earliest memories. Sometimes I dream about a woman singing. Pretty voice, real gentle. And there was a man who used to carve things out of wood. Made me a whistle once, but I lost it somewhere along the way. The description hit Caleb like a physical blow. He'd been a woodcarver himself once, back when Rose was alive. Had made her toys and trinkets, teaching her how to whittle simple shapes from soft pine. The silver locket that held her picture also contained a tiny wooden heart he'd carved for her 6th birthday, the birthday she'd never lived to see. What kind of things did he carve? Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. Animals, mostly. Little birds and rabbits. He was working on a horse when Danny's voice trailed off, and Caleb felt him shrug. Don't remember what happened after that. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves on the rocky trail providing a peaceful counterpoint to the mountain sounds around them. Caleb found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years, the familiar wilderness embracing him like an old friend. It was when they stopped to rest the horse and eat lunch that the first real moment of connection happened. Danny had wandered to a nearby stream to fill their water bottles, and when he returned, he was humming softly under his breath, a melody that made Caleb's heart stop. Where did you learn that song? Caleb asked, his voice sharper than he'd intended. Danny looked startled. Don't know. Just came to me, I guess. Why? Caleb forced himself to breathe normally. The tune was one he'd sung to Rose during their camping trips, a lullaby his own mother had taught him years ago. Hearing it from Danny's lips was like having his daughter's ghost reach across 20 years to touch him. No reason, he managed. Just sounded familiar. As they continued their journey that afternoon, Caleb found himself slipping into old patterns without realizing it. When Danny struggled with the difficult terrain, Caleb automatically reached out to steady him, the same protective instinct that had once driven him to teach Rose how to navigate the mountains safely. Watch that loose rock there, he said as they approached a narrow ledge. Step where I step and keep your weight centered. Danny followed his instructions with the quick intelligence of a child who'd learned early that paying attention could mean the difference between safety and disaster. But it was more than that. There was something in the way the boy moved, the way he processed information and adapted to new challenges. That reminded Caleb painfully of Rose. When they made camp that evening beside a small alpine lake, Caleb was building the fire when he heard Danny say something that nearly made him drop the bundle of kindling he was carrying. Rose would have loved this place. Caleb turned slowly, his heart pounding. What did you say? Danny was sitting on a fallen log, looking out over the water with a dreamy expression. Don't know why I said that. The name just popped into my head. Rose. Was my daughter's name? Caleb said quietly. The boy's eyes widened. Really? Is she? Does she live back in Cedar Falls? She died 20 years ago, Caleb replied, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. She was about your age. Danny's face crumpled with sympathy. I'm sorry. That must hurt real bad. It does, Caleb admitted. Perhaps the first time he'd spoken honestly about his grief to another living soul. They sat in silence as the fire caught and began to warm the circle of stones Caleb had arranged. Danny pulled out his harmonica and began to play softly, the melody hauntingly beautiful despite his obvious lack of formal training. She liked music too, Caleb said. My Rose used to sing all the time. What was she like? The question was asked with such gentle curiosity that Caleb found himself answering before he'd consciously decided to. Smart, as a whip, curious about everything. Had these big green eyes that seemed to see right through to your soul. Danny nodded solemnly. But she was pretty too. The prettiest thing you ever saw, Caleb agreed, his voice thick with emotion. As the evening progressed and they shared a simple meal of beans and hardtack, Caleb began teaching Danny some basic woodcraft skills. How to read the wind direction, how to identify edible plants, how to move quietly through the forest. The boy absorbed every lesson with eager attention, and Caleb felt the rusty mechanisms of fatherhood creaking back to life. "You're a natural," he told Danny as the boy successfully demonstrated how to tie a proper knot. "Got good hands and a quick mind." The praise made Danny beam with pride, and Caleb realized with a start that this was probably the first positive attention the boy had received in years. The thought made his chest tighten with protective anger at a world that would abandon such a bright, resilient child. When it came time to settle in for the night, Caleb spread his bedroll near the fire and gave Danny the warmer spot beside it. As he listened to the boy's breathing slowly deepen into sleep, Caleb stared up at the stars and tried to understand what was happening to him. For 20 years, he'd lived with the crushing weight of his failure to protect Rose. He told himself that he didn't deserve happiness, didn't deserve redemption, didn't deserve another chance at the love he'd lost. But this boy, this brave, damaged, hopeful child was challenging every truth he'd built his misery upon. In his sleep, Danny murmured something unintelligible and turned toward the fire, and in the flickering light, Caleb could see so clearly the features that had stopped him cold outside the blacksmith shop. Not just the eyes, but the stubborn set of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, even the small scar on his chin that could have been Rose's twin. "Sleep well, son," Caleb whispered, the endearment slipping out before he could stop it. Tomorrow they would continue their journey toward Silver Creek, and whatever family waited there for Danny. But tonight, in the peaceful silence of the mountains, Caleb allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have purpose again, to be needed, to matter to someone who looked at him with trust instead of pity or fear. It was a dangerous dream, he knew. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, lulled by the familiar sounds of the wilderness and the steady breathing of the child beside him, Caleb couldn't bring himself to care about the danger. For the first time in 20 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The third day brought them to Devil's Canyon, a treacherous stretch of trail that wound along a narrow ledge carved into the mountainside. The path was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, with a sheer rock face on one side and a deadly drop on the other. Caleb had navigated this passage countless times in his younger days, but today he felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a physical burden. "Stay close," he told Danny as they approached the most dangerous section. "Don't look down, and if I tell you to do something, do it immediately without question." Danny nodded solemnly, his small hands gripping Caleb's belt as they began the careful traverse. The boy's trust was absolute, and Caleb found himself praying to a God he'd stopped believing in 20 years ago, asking for steady footing and clear weather to see them safely through. They were halfway across when loose shale gave way beneath the Mare's hind legs. The horse stumbled, fighting for purchase on the crumbling ledge, and Danny was thrown against the rock wall with a sharp cry of pain. "Easy, girl," Caleb murmured to the horse, his voice calm despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Easy." Now, when the Mare regained her footing, Caleb immediately dismounted and helped Danny down, his hands shaking as he examined the boy for injuries. A jagged piece of rock had torn through Danny's sleeve and left an angry gash on his forearm, blood seeping through the fabric. "Just a scratch," Danny said bravely, though his face was pale with shock. "Let me be the judge of that," Caleb replied, his voice gentler than he'd intended. He carefully rolled up the boy's sleeve, relieved to see that while the cut was deep Enough to need attention. It wasn't life-threatening. From his saddlebags, Caleb retrieved the small medical kit he'd carried for years but rarely used. With practiced efficiency, born of countless minor injuries in the wilderness, he cleaned the wound with water from his canteen and applied a bandage with surprising gentleness. "There," he said, tying off the bandage. "That should hold until we can get it properly looked at." Danny stared at the careful work Caleb had done, his green eyes bright with unshed tears, not from pain, but from something deeper. "Nobody's ever taken care of me like that before," he said quietly. The simple statement hit Caleb like a physical blow. This boy, who couldn't be more than 10 years old, had apparently never experienced the basic kindness of having someone tend to his hurts. The thought of Danny facing the world alone, learning to clean his own wounds and comfort his own fears, made Caleb's chest tighten with protective fury. "Well," Caleb said gruffly, surprised by the emotion in his own voice, "everyone deserves to be looked after when they're hurt." That evening, they camped in a protected valley surrounded by towering pines. While Caleb built the fire and prepared their simple meal, Danny sat nearby, carefully examining the bandage on his arm with something approaching wonder. "You're good at this," Danny observed as Caleb handed him a plate of beans and salt pork. "Taking care of people, I mean?" "Had some practice," Caleb replied, settling down beside the fire. "My Rose was always getting into scrapes when we'd go camping. Skin knees, bee stings, that sort of thing." "You took her camping?" "Every chance I got," Caleb said, surprised by how easily the memories were flowing now. "She loved the mountains, said they made her feel closer to heaven." Danny considered this seriously. Maybe she's watching us now. From up there, I mean. The idea should have been painful, but somehow, coming from this earnest boy with Rose's eyes, it felt almost comforting. "Maybe she is," Caleb agreed after supper. Caleb surprised himself by reaching into his saddlebags and pulling out something he'd carried for 20 years, but never shared with another soul. A small, leather-bound book of fairy tales, its pages worn soft from countless readings. "This was Rose's favorite," he said, offering the book to Danny. "Thought you might like to look at it." Danny accepted the book with reverent care, running his small fingers over the faded cover. Could you read me one?" "I'm not so good with the big words yet." Caleb felt his throat constrict. How many nights had he sat just like this, with Rose curled up against his side, as he read story after story until her eyelids grew heavy. The memory was so vivid he could almost feel her warm weight against his ribs, could almost hear her sleepy voice asking for just one more story, Papa. "Sure," he managed, moving closer to Danny so they could both see the pages in the firelight. He opened to one of Rose's favorites, the story of a brave little girl who saved her village from a terrible dragon, not through violence, but through kindness and understanding. As Caleb read, his voice growing steadier with each page, he could feel Danny relaxing against his side, the boy's head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder. "That's a good story," Danny murmured when Caleb finished. "The little girl reminds me of someone, but I can't remember who." "Sometimes the best stories feel familiar," Caleb said, carefully closing the book. "Like they're telling us something we already knew but forgot." Danny was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Caleb with those devastating green eyes. "Do you think my family will want me? Really want me? I mean, not just feel sorry for me?" The question was asked with such vulnerable hope that Caleb felt his heart crack open. This boy had been alone for so long, had faced rejection and abandonment with a resilience that humbled Caleb to his core. The possibility that Danny's relatives might not welcome him with open arms was something Caleb couldn't bear to contemplate. "Any family would be lucky to have you," Caleb said firmly. "You're brave and kind and smart as a whip. If they can't see that, then they don't deserve you." But what if they can't see it? Danny persisted. What if they think I'm just trouble? Caleb looked at this child who'd already endured more hardship than most adults, who faced an uncertain future with courage and hope despite every reason to despair. The fierce protectiveness that had been growing in his chest since that first moment outside the blacksmith's shop suddenly crystallized into something unshakable. "Then you'll come home with me," he heard himself say, "and we'll figure it out together." Danny's face transformed with joy and relief so pure it took Caleb's breath away. The boy threw his arms around Caleb's neck in an impulsive hug that nearly brought tears to the mountain man's eyes. "You mean it?" Danny whispered against his shoulder. "I mean it," Caleb replied, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't felt in 20 years. As they settled in for the night, Danny curled up beside the fire with Rose's book clutched against his chest. Caleb stared up at the star-scattered sky and realized that something fundamental had shifted in his world. He'd started this journey thinking he was helping a lost boy find his family. Now he was beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, he was the one who'd been lost all along. The trading post at Millfield sat in a natural clearing between two ridges. Its weathered buildings clustered around a central courtyard like wagons circled against the wilderness. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the sound of hammering echoed from the blacksmith's forge as Caleb and Danny rode into the settlement on their 4th day of travel. Millfield served as a way station for travelers crossing the mountains, and though it was larger than Cedar Falls, it had the same feel of a place slowly being abandoned by progress. The few people moving about their business eyed the newcomers with the cautious interest of frontier folk friendly enough, but wary until proven otherwise. "We need supplies," Caleb told Danny as they dismounted outside the general store. "Salt, coffee, maybe some hardtack for the road. Won't take long." The store's interior was dim and cluttered, shelves lined with everything from farming tools to bolts of cloth. The proprietor, a stout man with graying whiskers, looked up from his ledger as they entered. "Help you folks?" he asked, his eyes noting Danny's bandaged arm and the obvious bond between the unlikely pair. "Need some traveling supplies," Caleb replied, moving toward the foodstuffs. "Coffee, salt, whatever hardtack you've got." While Caleb gathered their provisions, Danny wandered toward a bulletin board near the front window, his natural curiosity drawing him to the collection of notices and advertisements tacked to the weathered wood. Most were routine advertisements for farm equipment, notices of town meetings, rewards for lost livestock. But one particular poster caught his attention, and Caleb heard the sharp intake of breath that meant trouble. "What is it, son?" Caleb asked, moving to Danny's side. Danny was staring at a yellowed wanted poster, his face pale with shock and something that looked like betrayal. The paper was old, maybe 15 years or more, but the face sketched in crude detail was unmistakably Caleb's younger, harder, with the cold eyes of a man who'd lost his way. "Wanted dead or alive," the poster proclaimed in bold letters. "Caleb Rourke, known associate of the Mountain Devils Gang, reward $500. Armed and extremely dangerous." Caleb felt his stomach drop as he saw the poster through Danny's eyes. All the trust they built over the past few days, all the careful progress towards something resembling a family, it could all crumble in this moment. The boy had every right to be afraid, every reason to run from a man whose past was painted in blood and violence. "Danny," he began, but the boy stepped back, those green eyes wide with confusion and hurt. "You're a criminal," Danny whispered, the words carrying all the weight of a child's shattered faith. The store proprietor looked up from his ledger, sudden interest sharpening his features as he recognized the face on the poster. Other customers began to take notice, and Caleb could feel the atmosphere in the store shifting from casual curiosity to potential danger. Caleb said quietly, his eyes never leaving Danny's face. "I was a criminal a long time ago. Before you were born." before a lot of things. The poster says you killed people. Yes, Caleb replied simply. I did things I'm not proud of, things I can't take back. Danny's face crumpled with disappointment so profound it nearly brought Caleb to his knees. The boy had been abandoned by everyone who should have protected him, had learned to survive in a world that offered him nothing but cruelty and neglect. And now, the one person who'd shown him genuine kindness was revealed to be exactly the kind of man every decent person taught their children to fear. Why didn't you tell me? Danny asked, his voice barely audible. Because I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me now, Caleb admitted. The store had grown quiet, other customers watching the drama unfold with the morbid fascination of people witnessing a potential tragedy. The proprietor's hand had moved casually toward the shotgun mounted behind his counter, and Caleb could sense the shift in mood that might turn dangerous very quickly. We should go, he said softly to Danny. We can talk about this outside. But Danny didn't move, still staring at the poster as if it might change if he looked at it long enough. My whole life, people have told me I can't trust nobody. That everyone's got something they're hiding. I thought you were different. The words cut deeper than any physical wound Caleb had ever received. In them, he heard the voice of a child who'd been let down so many times that hope had become a luxury he couldn't afford. And now Caleb had become just another adult who'd proven that trust was a fool's game. I am different, Caleb said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. That man on the poster, that's not who I am anymore. How do I know that? Danny shot back, his voice rising with pain and anger. How do I know you won't hurt me too when it suits you? The question hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Around them, the other customers watched with the calculating expressions of people deciding whether they were witnessing a dangerous situation or merely an entertaining one. Caleb could have lied, could have made excuses or tried to minimize the crimes the poster represented. Instead, he knelt down so he was at Danny's eye level, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. You don't know, he said simply. You can't know for certain, because trust is always a leap of faith. But I can tell you this, the man I was when that poster was made died the same day my daughter did. I spent 20 years trying to figure out how to live with what I'd done, and I'm still trying. Danny's eyes searched his face, looking for something Caleb wasn't sure he possessed, some guarantee that the violence of his past wouldn't touch this innocent child. Did you really kill people? Danny asked. Yes. Bad people? Caleb hesitated. It would be easy to paint his victims as villains who deserved their fate, to make himself the hero of his own dark story. But Danny deserved better than comfortable. Lies. Some were bad, he said carefully. Some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I told myself I had reasons, but looking back, I think I was just angry at the world, and anyone who got in my way paid the price. Are you still angry? The question caught Caleb off guard. Was he still angry? The rage that had driven him to violence had been replaced long ago by guilt and grief. But underneath those emotions, did the capacity for violence still lurk? Not like I was, he said finally. That kind of anger, it burns everything it touches, including the person carrying it. I learned that the hard way. Danny considered this, his young mind wrestling with concepts that would challenge adults. Around them, the store's other customers began to lose interest, returning to their own business as it became clear that no immediate violence was forthcoming. The lady who took care of me when I was little, Danny said slowly, she used to say that people could change if they really wanted to, that everyone deserved a second chance. Smart lady, Caleb replied. You really promise you won't hurt me? I promise, Caleb said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Danny stared at him for a long moment, those green eyes so much like roses, seeing far more than any child should have to see. Finally, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said, quietly, but no more secrets. If there's other stuff about your past I should know, you tell me now. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched tight. The boy was giving him another chance, despite every reason not to. It was more grace than he deserved, and he was determined not to waste it. No more secrets, he agreed as they left the store with their supplies. Caleb caught the proprietor's speculative gaze and knew that word of his presence in Millfield would spread quickly. But for the moment, all that mattered was the small hand that slipped tentatively into his as they walked back to their horse, and the quiet voice that said, "I still want to go to Silver Creek with you, if you still want to take me." "I still want to take you," Caleb replied, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with questions about Danny's family and Caleb's own capacity for redemption. But as they mounted up and rode out of Millfield together, Caleb allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, second chances were real after all. That night, they camped beside a small creek that wound through a meadow dotted with late-season wildflowers. The confrontation in Millfield had left them both emotionally drained, and they went about the business of making camp with careful politeness, like strangers feeling their way through unfamiliar territory. After supper, as the last light faded from the western sky, Danny pulled out his harmonica and began to play. The melody was halting and unpracticed, but there was something hauntingly beautiful about the simple tune that seemed to capture all the loneliness and hope of their strange journey. "Where'd you learn to play?" Caleb asked, settling back against his saddle. "Taught myself mostly," Danny replied, lowering the harmonica. "Found it in an old trunk when I was maybe 7. The lady caring for me said I could keep it if I promised not to play it inside the house." Sounds like she wasn't much of a music lover. Danny shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who'd learned early not to expect much from the adults in his life. She wasn't much of anything, really. Fed me, gave me a place to sleep, but I always got the feeling I was more of a burden than anything else. The casual way Danny spoke about his childhood neglect made Caleb's chest tighten with protective anger. This boy should have been treasured, should have grown up secure in the knowledge that he was wanted and loved. Instead, he'd been treated like an inconvenience, shuffled from one reluctant caretaker to another. "Play that song again," Caleb said. "The one you were playing last night." Danny raised the harmonica to his lips and began the melody that had stopped Caleb cold the lullaby he'd sung to Rose during their camping trips. But now, instead of pain, the tune brought something approaching peace, as if Rose's memory was being honored rather than haunted. "My daughter used to love that song," Caleb said when Danny finished. "I'd sing it to her when we camp out under the stars, just like this." "What else did you do together?" Danny asked, his curiosity genuine and unguarded. Caleb found himself talking about Rose in a way he hadn't in 20 years, not with the crushing weight of grief and guilt, but with the warm nostalgia of a father remembering precious moments with his child. He told Danny about teaching Rose to fish, about the fort they built in the woods behind their cabin, about the way she'd insist on helping with everything from cooking to chopping wood, even when her help made the tasks take twice as long. "She sounds wonderful," Danny said softly. "She was," Caleb agreed. "Smart as a whip, brave as a lion, and stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something. Like me?" The question was asked with such hopeful innocence that Caleb felt his throat constrict. "Yeah," he said, "a lot like you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Finally, Danny spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "Do you think she'd like me? If she was still here, I mean?" "I think she'd love you," Caleb replied without hesitation. "I think you two would have been thick as thieves, getting into all sorts of trouble together." Danny smiled at that, and for a moment he looked younger than his years, more like the carefree child he should have been allowed to be. I never had a sister or a brother. Never had much family at all, really. What do? You remember about your parents? Caleb asked gently. Danny's expression grew distant as he searched his earliest memories. My mama had a pretty voice. She used to sing when she thought I was asleep, and she smelled like flowers roses, I think. My papa ... He frowned with concentration. He had big hands, real gentle though, and he was always making things. Little, wooden animals mostly. The description sent a chill down Caleb's spine. A woodcarver who made animal figures, just like he used to do. But that was probably coincidence. Lots of men worked with wood, especially on the frontier where carved toys were often the only playthings available for children. Anything else? Caleb prompted. There was a song Papa used to hum while he worked, Danny said slowly. Don't remember how it went exactly, but it made me feel safe. He raised the harmonica again and played a few tentative notes, the same melody he'd been playing since their first night on the trail. Caleb's blood turned to ice. The tune was one he'd hummed while whittling, a simple melody his own father had taught him years ago. The same tune he'd been humming the night he'd carved Rose's wooden heart. Danny, he said carefully, what was your mama's name? Sarah, I think. Why? Caleb's mind raced through possibilities, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. Sarah had been a common enough name on the frontier, and the details Danny remembered could apply to dozens of families. But the song, combined with the wood carving with those unmistakable green eyes. Do you remember your papa's name? Danny shook his head. The lady who took care of me never said. Just called him your father when she talked about him at all. A terrible suspicion was beginning to form in Caleb's mind, but he pushed it away. It was impossible. The grief and guilt of losing Rose were making him see connections that didn't exist, making him want so desperately for this boy to be more than a stranger, that he was inventing family ties that couldn't possibly be real. You look tired, he said, forcing his voice to remain calm. We should get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll reach Silver Creek, and you'll finally get to meet your family. Danny nodded and began settling into his bedroll, but Caleb remained sitting. By the dying fire, his mind churning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. The boy's memories were so similar to his own experiences with Rose, so eerily familiar that they couldn't be mere coincidence. But if Danny was somehow connected to his past, if the boy was family in ways neither of them understood, what did that mean for their journey to Silver Creek? What did it mean for the relatives Danny hoped to find there? As the fire burned down to glowing embers and Danny's breathing deepened into sleep, Caleb stared up at the star-filled sky and wondered if fate was playing an elaborate joke on him. For 20 years, he'd believed he'd lost everything that mattered. Now, just when he'd begun to imagine a future with this remarkable boy, he was discovering that their connection might run deeper than either of them had dreamed. The silver locket in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest, as if Rose's memory was trying to tell him something important. Tomorrow, in Silver Creek, he might finally understand what it was. But tonight, watching over this sleeping child, who looked so much like his daughter, Caleb allowed himself to hope that maybe the mountains had brought them together for reasons neither of them could fully comprehend. Maybe, just maybe, some families were chosen rather than born. Silver Creek lay nestled in a valley between two gentle hills, its main street lined with modest houses and small businesses that spoke of a community that had managed to survive while so many other frontier towns withered away. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in dusty yards, and the sound of normal life filled the air as Caleb and Danny rode into town on the afternoon of their 5th day of travel. The address from Danny's letter led them to Elm Street, a quiet residential area where modest frame houses sat behind white picket fences. Number 47 was a small cottage with a well-tended garden and lace curtains in the windows, the kind of home that should have been filled with the warmth of family. But as they approached the front gate, Caleb's heart sank. The house was clearly abandoned. Paint peeled from the shutters, weeds choked the once neat garden, and several windows were boarded up with rough planks. A wooden sign planted in the front yard declared the property for sale by owner. In faded letters, Danny stared at the empty house, his face pale with crushing disappointment. "They're gone," he whispered. "Let's find out what happened," Caleb said gently, dismounting and helping Danny down from the horse. Maybe they just moved to a different house in town. They approached the cottage next door, where an elderly woman was hanging laundry on a line stretched between two trees. She looked up as they approached, her weathered face kind but curious. "Excuse me, ma'am," Caleb said, touching the brim of his hat. "We're looking for the family that used to live next door." The boy here was hoping to find his relatives. The woman's expression softened as she looked at Danny's hopeful face. "Oh, dear," she said sadly. "The Hartwell family? They've been gone near on 2 years now. Lost them all to the cholera outbreak that swept through in '73. Danny's face crumpled as if he'd been physically struck. All the hope he'd carried for so many miles, all the dreams of finding family who would want him, crashed down around him in that single devastating moment. "All of them?" Caleb asked quietly. "Every last one," the woman confirmed. "Martha and her husband John, and their 2 little ones. Such a tragedy. They were good people, always ready to help a neighbor in need." Caleb put a protective arm around Danny's shoulders as the boy began to shake with silent sobs. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. They'd traveled all this way chasing hope, only to find that Danny's last chance at family had been buried in the town cemetery 2 years ago. "Was there anyone else?" Caleb asked. "Other relatives who might have known the family?" The woman shook her head. "The Hartwells kept to themselves mostly. Martha mentioned having a sister once, but she never said where she lived or what happened. To her, far as I know, there's no other family." As they walked away from the house that should have been Danny's salvation, the boy's composure finally cracked completely. He collapsed onto a bench outside the town's small general store, his shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. "I don't have anybody," he sobbed. "I'm all alone in the world." Caleb knelt beside the bench, his heart breaking for this brave child who'd endured so much only to have his dreams shattered at the very moment they seemed within reach. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "You've got me." But even as he spoke the words, Caleb felt the weight of his own inadequacy. What could he offer this boy? A broken-down drunk with a violent past and a cabin full of ghosts? Danny deserves so much more than that. "I need to ask around town," Caleb said. "Maybe someone knows something about other relatives, or at least can tell us more about your family." They spent the rest of the afternoon visiting every business in Silver Creek, asking anyone who would listen about the Hartwells and whether they'd had connections to other families in the area. Most people remembered the family fondly, but could offer no information about surviving relatives. It was at the saloon that they finally got their first real clue. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, who'd been serving drinks in Silver Creek for 20 years, remembered Martha Hartwell mentioning her sister. "Poor Martha," Pete said, polishing a glass with practiced motions. "She used to talk about her sister Sarah sometimes when she'd had a drink or two. Sighed Sarah had married young and moved away, somewhere up north, I think. But that was years ago, and I don't recall her ever saying where exactly." "Sarah," Caleb repeated, his pulse quickening. That was the name Danny had remembered for his mother. "You know," Pete continued thoughtfully, "there was something else. Martha had a photograph she was real proud of, showed it to me once when she was feeling sentimental. It was her and her sister as young women, and I swear that sister looked just like this boy here. Same eyes, same bone structure." Caleb felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Do you remember anything else about the sister? Anything at all?" Pete scratched his graying beard, thinking hard. Martha said something once about Sarah's husband being a woodcarver. Made toys for their little boy, but that's all I can recall. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place with terrifying clarity. Sarah, who'd married a woodcarver and had a son. Sarah, who'd had green eyes like her sister Martha. Sarah, who'd moved north and lost touch with her family. With trembling hands, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the torn photograph that had been tucked inside Danny's letter. He'd looked at it before, but hadn't paid much attention to the details. Now, studying it closely, he could see that it wasn't a picture of Danny's relatives at all. It was an old photograph of two young women, one of whom bore an unmistakable resemblance to Danny. "Pete," Caleb said, his voice barely steady, "would you look at this photograph and tell me if you recognize anyone?" The bartender took the faded picture and squinted at it in the lamplight. "Well, I'll be damned," he said slowly. "That's Martha Hartwell on the left, sure as I'm standing here. And the other woman," he looked from the photograph to Danny and back again. "That's got to be the sister, Sarah." Caleb's mind reeled with the implications. If Sarah was Danny's mother and Martha was Sarah's sister, then Danny wasn't just looking for distant relatives. He was looking for his aunt. An aunt who had died 2 years ago, along with any hope of finding the family connection he dreamed of. But there was something else, something that made Caleb's blood run cold. If Sarah had married a woodcarver who made toys for their son, if she'd moved north and lost touch with her family, then where was she now? What had happened to Danny's parents? "Danny," Caleb said carefully, kneeling beside the boy who was still slumped on the bench outside. "I need to show you something." He explained what Pete had told them, showed Danny the photograph, and helped him understand that Martha Hartwell had been his aunt, not just a distant relative. The revelation should have brought some comfort proof that he'd had family who cared about him, even if he'd never known them. Instead, it only deepened Danny's despair. "So I really am alone," he said dully. "My aunt's dead, and I still don't know what happened to my parents." Caleb stared at the boy's defeated posture, at those familiar green eyes now dull with hopelessness, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. The truth was becoming clearer with each passing moment, but he wasn't ready to voice his suspicions yet. Not until he was certain. "Listen to me," he said, taking Danny's hands in his own. "Whatever happened to your parents, wherever they are now, you are not alone. I meant what I said back on the trail. If you want to come home with me, if you want to be part of my family, then that's what we'll do." Danny looked up at him with something approaching hope. "You really mean that? Even though I'm nobody special, just another orphan nobody wants. You're not nobody," Caleb said fiercely. "You're the bravest, smartest, most remarkable boy I've ever known. And if the rest of the world is too blind to see that, then that's their loss." As they made arrangements to spend the night at Silver Creek's small inn before beginning the journey home, Caleb's mind churned with questions and possibilities. The connection between Danny and his own past was becoming impossible to ignore, but the full truth remained frustratingly out of reach. Tomorrow they would begin the journey back to Cedar Falls, not as strangers helping each other, but as something approaching a real family. But first, Caleb needed to understand exactly who Danny was and how their lives had become so impossibly intertwined. The answer, he suspected, lay somewhere in the shadows of his own fractured memories. And he was beginning to fear that when he finally found it, it would change everything he thought he knew about loss, redemption, and the mysterious ways that love could bloom even in the darkest places. That night at the Silver Creek Inn, Caleb lay awake staring at the ceiling while Danny slept in the bed beside him. The boy had cried himself to exhaustion after learning about his aunt's death, and now he slept with the deep, troubled rest of someone whose heart had been broken one too many times. But sleep eluded Caleb entirely. His mind raced with fragments of memory and half-formed suspicions that were slowly coalescing into a truth so profound it threatened to shatter everything. He thought he knew about his past. Sarah, a woman named Sarah who'd married a woodcarver and had a son with green eyes, a woman who'd lost touch with her family and moved north. The timing was right. Danny appeared to be about 10 years old, which would put his birth around the time that Caleb's own life had begun its downward spiral into violence and grief. As the hours crawled by, Caleb found himself remembering things he'd tried to forget. The period after Rose's death, when he drunk himself into near oblivion. The months that followed, when he'd emerged from his grief as someone harder, colder, more willing to solve problems with violence than words. He told himself he was protecting what remained of his family's legacy. But the truth was simpler and more damning. He'd been running from his pain, and everyone who got in his way had paid the price. But before all of that, in the brief, golden years when Rose was alive and the world still made sense, there had been friends, fellow trappers and their families, people who'd visited their cabin during the long winter months when the isolation might otherwise have driven them mad. One of those friends had been a young man named Michael Coleman, a woodcarver like Caleb himself, who'd married a beautiful woman with green eyes and auburn hair. Her name had been Sarah, and she'd been pregnant the last time Caleb had seen them, glowing with the joy of impending motherhood. That had been just months before the winter that took Rose, before Caleb's world collapsed and he'd lost touch with everyone who'd known him as anything other than a bitter, dangerous man. He'd never learned what happened to Michael and Sarah, had never thought to ask during the dark years that followed. Now, as dawn began to creep through the inn's small window, Caleb felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with devastating clarity. If Michael and Sarah had named their son Daniel Danny, if something had happened to them when the boy was still small, if Danny had somehow ended up in the care of strangers who knew nothing of his true parentage. No, Caleb whispered to the empty room. It's not possible. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. It was not only possible, it was the only explanation that made sense of all the strange coincidences that had brought them together. Danny wasn't just a homeless boy who happened to look like Rose. He was the son of Caleb's old friends, a child who should have grown up knowing Uncle Caleb and Cousin Rose, who should have been part of their extended family all along. If Caleb was right, then Danny wasn't a stranger at all. He was the closest thing to real family that Caleb had left in the world. The realization brought with it a crushing weight of guilt and responsibility. How many years had Danny spent alone and unwanted while Caleb drowned his sorrows in a bottle? How many nights had the boy gone hungry while Caleb wallowed in self-pity, completely unaware that Michael and Sarah's son needed him? When Danny finally woke, stretching and yawning in the pale morning light, Caleb was sitting by the window with his coat on, clearly ready to travel. "We leaving already?" Danny asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "Soon," Caleb replied. "But first, I need to take you somewhere." The Silver Creek Cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking the town, its modest headstones arranged in neat rows beneath towering pine trees. A low fence surrounded the grounds, and a caretaker's shed sat near. The entrance, tools neatly arranged on wooden shelves. "Why are we here?" Danny asked as they walked through the gates. "I want to see your aunt's grave," Caleb said. "I think she deserves that much respect after we came all this way." They found the Hartwell family plot without much difficulty. 4 graves clustered together beneath a spreading oak tree, their headstones bearing the simple inscription, "Taken by cholera 1873, Martha, John, and their 2 children." Just as the neighbor had said, Danny knelt beside his aunt's grave, his small hand tracing the letters of her name carved into the weathered stone. "I wish I could have met her," he said quietly. "I wish I could have known what it felt like to have family." "You do have family," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. "Danny, there's something I need to tell you, something about who you really are." The boy looked up at him with those devastating green eyes, and Caleb felt his resolve crystallize into absolute certainty. He could continue to live with his suspicions, could let Danny go through life, never knowing the truth about his connections to the past. Or he could take the risk of revealing everything, even if it meant opening old wounds that had never properly healed. "Your parents," Caleb began carefully. "Michael and Sarah Coleman. I knew them." Danny's eyes widened. "You knew my parents?" Michael was a friend of mine, back before my life went wrong. He was a good man, kind and gentle, and he loved your mother more than life itself. They used to visit us sometimes, him and Sarah, back when Rose was alive." "Rose knew my parents?" Caleb nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "You would have known her too, if things had been different. You and Rose would have grown up together, would have been like brother and sister." Danny stared at him in shock, trying to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. "That's why you looked at me that way, isn't it? Outside the blacksmith shop, I reminded you of her." "You reminded me of both of them," Caleb admitted. "Rose and your mother. They could have been sisters. They looked so much alike. And you have your mother's eyes and your father's stubborn chin and Rose's way of tilting your head when you're thinking hard about something. What happened to them?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My parents, I mean. What happened?" Caleb shook his head sadly. "I don't know. After Rose died, I lost touch with everyone. Spent too many years feeling sorry for myself to check on the people who mattered. By the time I came back to my senses, it was too late to find out what had become of them." Danny was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this revelation about his true identity and his connection to Caleb's past. Finally, he looked up with those familiar green eyes and asked the question that Caleb had been dreading. "Does this change anything? Between us, I mean?" Caleb knelt beside the boy, taking his small hands in his own weathered ones. "It changes everything and nothing," he said. "It means you're not just some stranger I decided to help. You're family, Danny. Real family. You're the son of two people I cared about very much, and you're as close to a nephew as I'm ever likely to have. But it doesn't change how I feel about you," Caleb continued. "These past few days, traveling together, getting to know you, I didn't care about you because of who your parents were. I cared about you because of who you are, because you're brave and kind and smart, and because spending time with you has reminded me what it feels like to have something worth protecting again." Danny threw his arms around Caleb's neck, holding on tight as if he was afraid this moment of belonging might disappear if he let go. "I want to stay with you," he whispered. "I want to be your family for real." "Then, that's what we'll do," Caleb replied, his own arms tightening around the boy's small frame. "We'll go home to Cedar Falls, and we'll build a life together. Not because we have to, but because we want to." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out something he'd been carrying for 20 years, Rose's silver locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. Inside was a tiny photograph of his daughter, smiling with the innocent joy of a child who believed the world was good and safe. "I want you to have this," he said, placing the locket in Danny's palm. "Rose would have wanted you to have it. You're part of her story now, part of our family story." Danny stared at the locket with wonder, carefully opening it to look at the photograph inside. "She's beautiful," he breathed. "She was," Caleb agreed. "And she would have loved you just as much as I do." The words slipped out before he could stop them. The morning of their final day on the trail dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the grass and their breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Cedar Falls lay just a few hours ahead, waiting to welcome them home as father. And sundawn as they broke camp and prepared for the last leg of their journey. Caleb found himself studying Danny's face in the golden morning light. The boy looked different somehow, less guarded, more relaxed, as if the weight of uncertainty that had been pressing down on him for years had finally been lifted from his small shoulders. "You nervous about going home?" Caleb asked as they mounted. "A little," Danny admitted. "What if people don't like the idea of me living with you? What if they think I don't belong?" It was a valid concern. Cedar Falls was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Caleb's sudden return with an adopted son would certainly raise eyebrows. There would be questions, gossip, perhaps even some disapproval from those who remembered his violent past. "Then they'll have to deal with me," Caleb said firmly. "You're my son now, Danny, legally and in every way that matters. Anyone who has a problem with it will need to take it up with me personally." The fierce protectiveness in his voice seemed to reassure Danny, who nodded and settled more comfortably in the saddle behind him. They rode in companionable silence through the familiar mountain passes, both lost in their own thoughts as they prepared to begin their new life together. It was Danny who first spotted the smoke rising from Cedar Falls chimneys, thin gray columns, reaching toward the sky like fingers pointing the way home. "There it is," he said, excitement creeping into his voice. Our town. Our town." The phrase sent a warm surge of satisfaction through Caleb's chest. Danny already thought of Cedar Falls as home, already saw himself as belonging somewhere for the first time in his young life. As they descended the final hill into town, people began to notice their return. Mrs. Patterson emerged from her boarding house, shading her eyes against the morning sun as she watched them approach. Sheriff Martinez stepped out of his office, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun belt before he recognized the familiar figures. But it was Doc Henderson who approached them first, his weathered face creased with concern and curiosity, as he took in the sight of Caleb and Danny riding together with obvious familiarity. "Caleb," the doctor said as they dismounted outside his office, "didn't expect to see you back so soon. How did the journey go?" "Better than expected," Caleb replied, placing a protective hand on Danny's shoulder. "Doc, I'd like you to meet my son, Daniel Rourke." The doctor's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but to his credit, he quickly recovered and extended his hand to Danny with genuine warmth. "Pleased to meet you, Daniel. I hope you'll like it here in Cedar Falls." "I will," Danny said confidently, shaking the doctor's hand with careful politeness. "Papa's told me a lot about everyone." Papa. The word hit Caleb like a physical blow, but it was a good kind of pain, the ache of a heart expanding to accommodate more love than it had held in 20 years. He'd been Papa to Rose once, had thought he'd never hear that title spoken with such trust and affection again. Word of their return spread quickly through the small town, and soon a small crowd had gathered in the street outside Doc Henderson's office. Caleb could see the curiosity and speculation in their faces, could practically hear the questions forming in their minds. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Caleb, might I have a word with you, privately?" Caleb felt Danny tense beside him, clearly worried that this was the moment when their new family would be challenged or threatened. "Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of my son," Caleb replied evenly. Martinez looked from Caleb to Danny and back again, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I'm just wondering about the legalities of the situation. The boy's adoption, his guardianship, all taken care of," Caleb interrupted, pulling the official documents from his coat pocket. "Signed and witnessed in Silver Creek. Danny is my son in the eyes of the law." The sheriff examined the papers with professional thoroughness, then handed them back with a nod. "Seems to be in order. Welcome to Cedar Falls, Daniel." Mrs. Patterson had been watching the exchange with growing emotion, and now she stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Caleb," she said softly. "It looks just like—" "I know," Caleb said gently, "but he's not her. He's himself, and he's going to be just fine." The older woman nodded, understanding immediately what he meant. Then she turned to Danny with a warm smile. "Young man, you must be hungry after your long journey. Why don't you come by the boarding house later for a proper meal? I make the best apple pie in 3 counties. Danny's face lit up with delight. "I'd like that very much, ma'am. Thank you." As the crowd began to disperse, each person taking time to welcome Danny to the community with varying degrees of warmth and curiosity, Caleb felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. This was how it should be, a father and son coming home together, being accepted by their neighbors, beginning the simple, ordinary life that was really the most extraordinary gift of all. "Come on, son," he said, taking Danny's hand. "Let me show you our cabin. Let me show you home." The cabin on the hill looked different through Danny's eyes. Caleb realized as they approached the front porch together. What had been a refuge for grief and solitude was now a family home, a place where a boy could grow up surrounded by love and stability. "It's perfect," Danny breathed, taking in the sturdy log walls, the wide front porch, and the view of the mountains stretching endlessly beyond. "I can't believe this is really mine now." "Ours," Caleb corrected gently. "This is our home." Inside, the cabin felt transformed by Danny's presence. The boy moved through the rooms with reverent curiosity, touching surfaces and examining details as if he were exploring a palace instead of a simple mountain dwelling. When they reached the small back room that would become Danny's bedroom, he stood in the doorway with wonder. "My own room," he whispered. "I've never had my own room before." Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion. Such a simple thing, 4 walls and a window, a bed and a place to keep personal belongings, but for Danny, it represented security and belonging in ways that most children took for granted. "We'll need to get you some proper furniture," Caleb said. "A desk for your schoolwork, maybe some shelves for books. Whatever you need to make it feel like home." Danny turned to him with those brilliant green eyes shining with unshed tears. "I already feel at home," he said simply. "Being with you makes it home." That evening, they sat together on the front porch as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Danny had changed into his new clothes, and with his face clean and his hair combed, he looked like any other well-cared-for child. But Caleb could still see the resilience in his posture, the hard-won wisdom in his eyes that spoke of battles fought and survived. "Tell me about tomorrow," Danny said, leaning against Caleb's shoulder with the easy affection of a child who finally felt safe enough to be vulnerable. "Tomorrow we'll start settling in properly," Caleb replied. "I'll take you to meet Miss Sarah. She's the school teacher. We'll get you enrolled in classes so you can start catching up on your education. And after school? After school, you'll come home to me," Caleb said, the words carrying a weight of promise and commitment that would have terrified him a week ago. "We'll do homework together, maybe work on some carving projects. I thought I might teach you to fish, if you're interested." "I'm interested in everything," Danny said eagerly. "I want to learn everything you can teach me." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Caleb found himself thinking about the future with something he hadn't felt in 20 years' anticipation. There would be school plays to attend, injuries to tend, bedtime stories to read. There would be difficult conversations about Danny's past and his parents, moments when grief would surface unexpectedly for both of them. But there would also be laughter echoing through the cabin's rooms, the sound of young feet running up and down the stairs, the simple daily miracle of watching a child discover the world through eyes that were finally free to be curious instead of merely cautious. "Papa?" Danny said softly, using the title that was becoming more natural with each passing hour. "Yes, son? Do you think my mama and papa would be happy? About us being together, I mean?" Caleb considered the question seriously. Michael and Sarah Coleman had been good people, the kind of parents who would have wanted their son to be loved and protected above all else. They would have wanted Danny to have a family, even if it wasn't the family they'd originally planned for him. "I think they'd be very happy," Caleb said finally. "They want you to be loved and safe and cared for. They'd want you to have someone who thought you were the most important person in the world. Is that what you think?" Danny asked shyly. "That I'm important? I think you're the most important thing that's ever happened to me," Caleb replied. "Honestly, I think you saved my life just as much as I saved yours." Danny nestled closer against his side, and Caleb wrapped his arms around the boy's small frame, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. A week ago, he'd been a broken man haunted by ghosts and guilt. Tonight, he was a father again, with all the terror and joy that title entailed. "I love you, Papa," Danny murmured, his voice thick with sleepiness. "I love you too, son," Caleb replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than you'll ever know." As Danny's breathing deepened into sleep, Caleb carried him inside and tucked him into the bed they'd prepared in his new room. The boy's face was peaceful in the lamplight, finally free of the worry and uncertainty that had marked his features when they'd first met. Standing in the doorway of his son's room, watching over Danny's sleep as he once watched over Rose's, Caleb felt the last of his defenses crumble completely. This remarkable child had given him something he'd thought was lost forever: the chance to be the man he'd once been, the father he'd failed to be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight, surrounded by the quiet contentment of home and family, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe redemption was real after all. Maybe second chances weren't just fairy tales, but gifts that waited patiently for hearts brave enough to accept them. 3 months had passed since that autumn day when Caleb first saw Danny huddled against the blacksmith's wall, and Cedar Falls had transformed from a dying frontier town into something that felt alive again. Snow blanketed the mountains and rooftops, and the warm glow of lamplight in windows spoke of families gathered around hearths, sharing stories and simple contentment. The cabin on the hill buzzed with the energy of a home where love lived. Danny's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long, and the sound of his voice calling, "Papa, come look at this," had become Caleb's favorite music. The boy had taken to his new life with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never dared to hope for such happiness. School had been a revelation for Danny. Miss Sarah Henderson, Doc's niece, who'd come to teach Cedar Falls children, had quickly recognized the boy's sharp intelligence and eagerness to learn. Within weeks, he was reading at grade level and showing a particular aptitude for arithmetic that reminded Caleb painfully of Rose's quick mind. "He's remarkable," Miss Sarah had told Caleb during a parent conference. "I've never seen a child so hungry for knowledge. He absorbs everything like a sponge." The townspeople had accepted Danny with varying degrees of warmth, but acceptance. Nonetheless, Mrs. Patterson had become a surrogate grandmother, teaching him to bake and fussing over his appearance before school each morning. Sheriff Martinez had taken to including Danny in his rounds sometimes, teaching him about responsibility and community service. Even more importantly, Danny had begun to make friends among the other children. At first, he'd been shy and uncertain, clearly unfamiliar with the rhythms of childhood friendship. But his natural kindness and quick wit had soon won over his classmates. And now, the cabin often echoed with the sounds of multiple children playing together. This particular evening found Caleb and Danny in the front room, working on their respective projects by the light of the fire. Caleb was repairing a neighbor's broken chair, while Danny laboriously wrote in a composition book, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on forming each letter perfectly. "What are you working on there?" Caleb asked, looking up from his woodwork. "Miss Sarah assigned us to write about our families for the Christmas program," Danny replied without lifting his head. "I'm writing about you and Rose and my birth parents, about how families can be made lots of different ways." Caleb set down his tools and moved to read over Danny's shoulder. The boy's handwriting was careful and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood the weight of language. "My family is different from some," Danny had written. "My papa found me when I was lost and alone, and he chose to love me even though he didn't have to. My sister Rose lives in heaven now, but she's still part of our family because we tell stories about her and keep her memory alive. My birth mama and papa are in heaven too, but they sent me to the right place to find the love they would have given me if they could." Caleb felt his eyes burn with tears he wasn't ashamed to shed. In a few simple sentences, this remarkable boy had captured the essence of what they built together, not a replacement for what had been lost, but something entirely new and precious in its own right. "That's beautiful, son," Caleb managed, his voice thick with emotion. Danny looked up at him with those familiar green eyes, Rose's eyes, Sarah's eyes, but most importantly, his own. "Is it true, though? What I wrote about Rose still being part of our family is the truest thing you've ever written," Caleb assured him. That night, as had become their custom, they sat together on the sofa while Caleb read aloud from the fairy tale book that had once belonged to Rose. Danny never tired of hearing the stories, and Caleb had discovered that sharing them didn't hurt anymore. Instead, it felt like a bridge, connecting past and present, loss and renewal. When it came time for bed, Danny performed his nightly ritual of carefully placing Rose's silver locket on his bedside table, always within reach but treated with the reverence due a sacred object. The photograph inside had become something Danny treasured, not because it represented his lost sister, but because it symbolized his place in a family story that stretched backward and forward through time. "Papa?" Danny said as Caleb tucked him in, his voice soft with approaching sleep. "What is it, son?" "Do you think we'll have a good Christmas?" The question was asked with the careful hope of someone who'd never had reason to expect good things, but was learning to believe they might be possible. Caleb smoothed the boy's hair with gentle fingers, marveling as he did every night at the simple miracle of being needed again. "I think we'll have the best Christmas either of us has ever had," he said honestly, and he meant it. Tomorrow they would cut down a tree from the hillside behind the cabin. Mrs. Patterson had promised to help them make ornaments, and Doc Henderson had hinted about a special gift he was crafting in secret. There would be stories and songs, perhaps some of the other families joining them for Christmas dinner. But more than any of that, there would be the simple, extraordinary joy of family-chosen family, built from love and commitment rather than mere blood, but no less real for all its UNEXPECTEDNESS. As Caleb settled into his own bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of Danny's peaceful sleep from the next room, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A week of travel through mountain passes had become a lifetime of love, transforming two broken souls into something whole and hopeful. On his own bedside table sat a new photograph, a formal portrait they'd had taken in Silver Creek, showing father and son standing together with quiet pride and unmistakable affection. It was the first family photograph Caleb had possessed in 20 years. And looking at it filled him with a contentment he'd never thought to feel again. Outside, snow continued to fall softly over Cedar Falls, blanketing the town in peaceful silence. Inside the cabin on the hill, love had taken root and flourished, proving that some gifts arrive not when we expect them, but exactly when we need them most. In the morning, there would be breakfast to make and school to attend, chores to complete, and stories to share. There would be the ongoing miracle of ordinary days made extraordinary by the presence of someone who mattered more than life itself. For now, though, there was simply this, the deep satisfaction of a man who'd learned that redemption comes not through grand gestures, but through the daily choice to love and be loved in return. Tomorrow would bring its own joys and challenges, but tonight, surrounded by the quiet happiness of home, Caleb Rourke was exactly where he belonged.